Hello and hi, welcome to the Fortinus Events Global Podcast series, where we explore the evolving realities of HR, leadership, and workforce transformation across industries. I'm your host Rashika, and today we are joined by someone with extensive experience leading HR in highly operational and complex environments. So today we are joined by Dharma Chandran, an experienced executive leader, board advisor, and people strategist with extensive experience across multiple markets, including Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, and Dubai. So in this episode, we'll explore the human side of business, from leading a cross-cultural and driving organizational transformation to the future of HR and the evolving role of people leaders. So Dharma, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, could you please briefly introduce yourself and share a little about your professional journey?
Thank you for having me. Very nice to be here. I'm currently the Chief Corporate Services Officer for Toll Group, which is wholly owned by Japan Post. We operate in freight forwarding and third-party contract logistics. Excuse me. And I've been with the company now just over 2 years. I also serve on 2 boards as a non-executive director. Both InfraBuild, a steel maker privately owned based out of Sydney in Australia, and also McMahon, which is listed on the Australian Stock Exchange and provides contract mining and construction services, and also based out of Australia, but operating in Indonesia and Malaysia as well. So those are my roles, and I'm very delighted to be with you talking about this topic, and look forward to our conversation.
Yes, thank you so much, Dharma, for the introduction. So now let's jump into our discussion. So first thing first, you had built your career across Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, and Dubai by passion. So to work with organizations in diverse business departments. So now, how have these experiences across different regions influenced your approach to HR leadership and strategy?
It's a good question. I also have played those roles. Not only those are the countries I've lived in and worked in, but I've also traveled a lot and been responsible for countries other than the ones I lived in. So I've had regional and global roles in that aspect. So not just those countries, but working with people for lots of other different cultures as well in Europe, North America, and Asia. And I've also done that in 3 different roles. Corporate executive, but in my earlier career, I was a management consultant. So a partner in some consulting firms like EY, KPMG, and other HR consulting firms like Towers Perrin and Few Associates. And more recently, I've been a non-executive director as well in some companies. So not only across cultures, but different roles across those cultures. And I think, there are similarities and there are differences. I think mostly the aspirations are similar. Most people want to succeed. They want to provide for their families. They want the best for their children. They want to contribute to their communities. So I think the aspirations are pretty much the same across most of those cultures, all of them. But the way in which we process information, we respond and react to it can vary. And if you've got team members from lots of different cultures working sometimes together in the office, but sometimes virtually because people are in different countries, it can be useful to understand what those differences are in terms of the way people process information and the way people respond to various stimuli.
Mm-hmm. Understand. So I guess all this experience that you have, it has shaped how you, how your leadership and business strategy are doing today.
Yes, it has. In particular, whenever I'm working in a new country, one I don't have a lot of experience in, or when I'm working with team members from multiple countries, I do my best, one, to understand their culture and how they react to certain information. Some countries, it's more collective. People make decisions for the collective good. Other countries more individualistic. We also have countries that are more hierarchical in nature in terms of decision making. Other cultures are more egalitarian, and so on. And so, understanding how people respond to information helps you figure out what's the best way to communicate with them and to in both motivate and encourage them to drive towards a common goal.
Understood. Okay, thank you so much, Dharma, for the response for the first question. So now moving on with the next one. So you have led teams and advised organizations across very different cultures, from Asia to the Middle East and Australia. So that what is the biggest misconception senior leaders have when they assume the same leadership approach can be applied across different regions and cultures?
It's a common one. Most of us are ethnocentric. We've got the World Cup football on at the moment. And ethnocentricity is what makes us cheer for our country or our team or our culture. So it's normal for most human beings to have this bias that says the way things are in my country are probably the way things are in other countries. Now, this is not a conscious bias, because if you ask someone, what are the differences between cultures? They'll say, oh, yeah, definitely there are differences. And they might even be able to say, well, but sometimes when they are working or behaving in a workplace, they forget that. And they default to assume that every other culture processes information and behaves in the same way, or values the same things. I have many examples of this where you can bring, for instance, what is a very egalitarian approach in Australia to a culture in North Asia, which might be more hierarchical. And you think you're doing the right thing because you're trying to be inclusive, but really the culture is much set up for that. And sometimes it can be embarrassing to people when you're overly friendly with subordinates, etc., in some cultures, or even overly familiar with people you report to in some cultures where formality is the custom.
Understood. So one shoes doesn't fit off for all these regions, right? So you need to check, and you need to learn what exactly works best for every different regions.
Yeah, and there's a lot of research around that moment for the early stuff by Gerd Hofstede and Fons Trompenas to the more recent research by Aaron Monahan. You can start by, I guess, educating yourself, informing yourself about what goes on. And then I think it's also useful when you're in those countries or in those meetings with different people, just checking in, because, sometimes the research is very accurate, but sometimes it might not be for that particular group of people, or there might be subcultures within cultures. It's useful to just check in to see how do people like to have their communication presented to them? How do they like to engage in problem solving, in discussions and debates? Do they like to receive a lot of material in advance of the meeting? Or would they prefer to have the conversation and have the confirmation later in writing? What is the preference of that group? I think that's important. Yeah. So no, one size does not fit all, I found.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Okay. That's a very good one, Darga. Thank you for that. So moving on to the next one. Culture transformation is a key priority for many organizations today, especially as businesses become more global and interconnected. So now, in your view, what are the most critical factors in successfully driving cultural transformation across diverse team markets?
I think the key to having a successful cultural transformation, which is not easy, is being very clear and very specific about what it is you're trying to change. What aspect of the culture are you trying to change? A lot of people start on these journeys without a clear picture in mind of what good looks like or what the change is going to result in. And all they're driven by is the fact of feeling or a opinion that the current culture is inadequate in some way. And sometimes they can even describe that inadequacy, but they're not that great at painting the picture of what instead. So, they have some view of the from and some view of what in the from doesn't work, but they don't have a very clear, specific picture of to what. And I think that probably is the single biggest failing in cultural transformations, not being able to clearly articulate what the finished product or finished culture will look like. I think the second is also figuring out how. And in my view, a lot of the times, culture, we try to change it by pulling only one lever or two levers. And the most common ones are structures and incentives. These are the two main ones that people pick for changing culture. They're important, but I think on their own insufficient. So people will change the structure of the organization and then expect the culture to fall in aligned with that structure, or they will provide incentives for people to change by either structuring their short-term or long-term incentive plans to drive that cultural change. I think these are essential components of a cultural change, but on their own, not enough. And I think we need to employ lots of different levers and some very subtle ones. What you think listening to employees, what's important to the understanding their personal motivations, categorizing them, weighting those personal motivations and trying to address them in the right way. Sometimes it's a learning and development program or growth or training program. Sometimes it's coaching and mentoring. Sometimes it's even helping them design work around the way they want the work to be. And I think operating models, workforce planning, and the way that work itself appears people's these days with technology plays such an important part, all can shape culture. And you should pull all of those levers in a very coherent and concerted effort where you have aligned with all of those. They pull in the same direction rather than pull in different directions in order to get a really successful cultural transformation.
Understand? Okay, so you need to just again do your research, and then you try to understand which approach is the best, and you do it through, just let them know what the transformations that you're going to do so they understand it better and you'll be successful after that.
Yeah, being very clear on what the end result looks like, but also being clear to begin with what the current state is. Sometimes we have a clear view of that, but other times we don't. And it's useful to use some survey instruments to figure out what the current culture is, but also study behaviors, artifacts, and other things that point to the current culture.
Understood. Okay, thank you so much, Dharma, for that. So now next question. For HR professionals operating in an increasingly global business environment, developing people strategies that work across markets can be challenging. So now, what advice would you give HR leaders that are looking to build globally relevant people strategies while maintaining strong local culture alignment and supporting business objectives?
Yeah, this is a really difficult one, another challenging question, because, in global organizations, standardization is important to get economies of scale, consistencies of process, aid and mobility of the workforce across the organization. On the other hand, there are cultural and other nuances, demographic or geopolitical, in specific jurisdictions that require you to tailor or customize your approach to that particular. And in knowing which elements of HR strategy should be tight and should be conformed across the group versus which ones can be a bit looser and be a bit more flexible within a group across countries is, really one of the difficult things that all of us leaders grapple with. I liken it to a picket fence, but I think in most organizations, you can think of it as a picket fence. You've got a lot of pickets in a picket fence, but you only have a handful of railings that hold the picket fence together. Without that railing, the picket fence loses structural integrity, especially if there's a storm, bad weather. So you do need a few things, but usually things that are common will be fewer than the things that are more bespoke to the country. So just like a picket fence, there'll be more pickets than railings. And the reason for that is the larger and the more complex your organization is, the more global the true legals. I think we had over 150 countries going back to the World Cup. 150 countries try to qualify for the World Cup, and we have 38 in there. The bigger your organization, the more countries, the more continents, the more different cultures it cuts across, the fewer things I think you can standardize completely. You still need to standardize a number in order to get the cost efficiencies and the effectiveness that is required. But if you think you can centrally control a large, guild or complex country with differing economic and development cycles, I think that's when you can run into trouble.
I understand. Okay, thank you, Dharma, for the brief explanation of that. Sunda, last but not least. So looking ahead, the HR function continues to evolve with changing workforce expectations, technology advancements, and new business challenges. What do you believe will be the top 3 shifts in HR over the next 5 years? And how do you see these trends impacting organizations and Singapore's HR landscape?
Yeah, I think the 3 that come to mind, obviously AI and robotics are 2 aspects of it. And many of us people who work in an office often only think of AI when we don't think enough about robotics, because I think, a lot of jobs still remain manual, whether you're in mining, construction, or in our case, logistics and warehouses. There's a lot of work that is still fairly manual. We'll forget that. And so I think robotics combined with AI, will also displace and disrupt some of those roles. Certainly the office-based roles, AI is going to have some disruption. But I think the companies that can manage the transition and figure out where the value add is for the human versus the machine is going to be, and how that human and machine can interact with each other in the most effective way will win the day and be more competitive than those who simply use it as an efficiency to remove high-cost labor and replace it with machines. Because I think that will yield some dividends, but not it'll certainly yield an efficiency dividend, but not an effectiveness dividend potentially. And we have the second trend, I think, is you're seeing the early transformation of the HR function to include some technology components. At Atlassian, for instance, I think the HR director now has AI enablement as part of their role. And I think at Grab in Singapore, same thing has happened. I think, if I'm not mistaken. And certainly Moderna globally has combined those 2 roles. Now, is this the canary in the coal mine that is telling us this is how everybody's going to go? It's too early to tell. But that's another trend we're seeing. And then finally, I think the whole nature of work and workforce planning is to change. And I think it'll change more from headcount, FTE, and functions and divisions. It'll change to more agile gig type relationships where people come in and do a particular work for a particular amount of time, whether that's internally, whether you're a talent pool internally that is deployed to various problems to help solve it, and what combination of human and agent will combine to solve those problems. I think that's going to be the third major trend.
Okay, understand. Okay, thank you so much, Dharma, for sharing your analytic perspectives today and for your time. So your insights highlight the importance of putting people at the center of business transformation and building organizations that are ready for the future. So everyone, to our listeners and viewers, Dharma will also be joining us as a featured speaker at the CHRO and HR Leaders Services Board, where he will be sharing further insights with the other senior HR leaders and industry professionals on navigating the evolving workplace landscape. So, Dharma, do you have anything else to say before we end the session today?
Only to say I'm hopeful that the human resource function will continue to thrive. It will certainly change and not look maybe the way it does today, but will continue to thrive and be an important profession and an important function for organizations to come. And happy to elaborate on that further at the conference, of course, which I'm looking forward to, and sharing and exchanging thoughts and ideas with others.
Indeed. So yes, to hear more from Dharma and connect with fellow HR leaders, join us at the CHRO Summit on the 18th of August. So to everyone tuning in, thank you for joining us. We'll see you at the summit. Thank you so much again, Dharma, and thank you everyone. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye.